Hi, and welcome to everybody who's watching this live on our Facebook channel. I am joined today by Elizabeth Wuerz of the Sustained Dialogue Institute. And we were just trying to figure this out before we started streaming this. I guess Elizabeth came to Notre Dame about 3.5-ish years ago. Maybe it was exactly 3, maybe exactly 4, to help us set up our Sustained Dialogue program, our peer-led Dialogue Fellows program for God and the Good Life. So that program is entirely based off of the technique or the methodology that the Sustained Dialogue Institute has developed and has been teaching for many years. I'll let Elizabeth introduce it here in just a second, but I want to say thanks, first of all, just for joining us. We've gained so much from you guys over the years, and from you personally, just like so many insights into dialogue. And I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure and happy to be here. And I'm excited to see how much this course has expanded and grown to be really incredible. So I'm thankful for what you're doing to spread this work as well.
Oh my gosh, so much gratitude at the outset. I love it. So let me I'm going to share my screen here like I usually do, so that folks afterwards can scroll through and kind of locate themselves in the conversation. So Elizabeth, the first question that I want to ask you is just to give us a bit more background about sustained dialogue. And it can be pretty basic. Like I said, a lot of people in our community have some familiarity with it. But what is it to sustain a dialogue? And then also, what does your institute do more broadly? What are you guys up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me if I'm talking too long on this one, but Sustained Dialogue Institute was founded by Hal Saunders, who was the former Assistant Secretary of State under President Carter. And he founded the organization after his time in government, seeing that when he brought together Arabs and Israelis to try to hash out a peace agreement, that people naturally go through this process as they come together over a sustained period of time, the same people over and over and over again. They go through what he then coined as a 5-stage process. So they're sharing experiences, they're learning about each other, they're building relationships across different perspectives and divides. And then only then can they really start to look at the root causes of different challenges and then come up with some sort of way to address them more effectively. So he took what he saw as a natural process and created the Sustained Dialogue Institute to use it in various different settings. So it's been used as international peacekeeping type of conflict resolution world. And then in 1999, it was adapted to the campus-based setting. And it started out at Princeton University, and then and it's slowly expanded. So I think we're in over 50 campuses now across the United States. And we work in colleges and universities, in communities, and then internationally as well.
That's awesome. So with the campus outreach arm, is this the main focus now of the Institute, or do you still sort of have different branches like international peace discussions, or is the campus dialogue what you mainly focus on?
The campus dialogue is most of our work at this point. We do work in different professional settings, but most of our work is focused on undergraduate institutions. Yeah.
Cool. And would you say, so you said it's a 5-stage process. I like that. I like processes and I like things that have different stages. But the process is just a process of dialogue, right? So it's like a way of structuring like just conversation or dialogue amongst a group of people over time. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. So he would say what happens naturally if you bring together the same group of people over and over and over again to dialogue. They will naturally go through this process, this 5-stage process. Now, what we've done is we've taken that and we've adapted it in the sense that we teach, okay, as a facilitator of dialogue, you will start to notice certain things, and that means you can start to move into the next stage. So we've made it a little bit more structured, but yeah.
Yeah. And then, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but the stages, the 5 stages, is there a way of briefly kind of characterizing each of those?
Yeah, so stage 1 would be what we call the who stage. So that's who should be in the dialogue, what are we, who should be at the table. And that also starts the first dialogue session. So that's where we start talking about setting up the container, talking about group norms, all of those sorts of things, the structure for it. Stage 2 is the what stage. So that's when people think about dialogue, they think about that, what we call our stage 2 dialogue. So that's really the storytelling phase of what people are sharing experiences, how they have been impacted by whatever topic is the conversation is about. Stage 3 is the why phase. So we tend to talk about why is something happening. So if we're talking about a particular topic and we've shared our impact and experiences with it, okay, why are we having those types of experiences? And then stage 4 is the how. So that tends to be, okay, we have a sense of why something is happening. How can we address it? How can we, what do we want to do about it? And then the stage 5 is now. So oftentimes some of our work is taking action outside of the dialogue space to improve.
Yeah, would you say, so most of the groups on campuses that you guys are training and working with, or I guess, are most of them in the context of a particular class, or is it usually kind of something that you're setting up as an extracurricular activity for students, or is it usually something that you've been asked to do in response to a particular incident, or like who are you usually training and sort of guiding through the process?
Yeah, it tends to be all of the above. Most, I would say, are typically some form of co-curricular work. But we do have several campuses that have it built into a course, whether it's integrated into the classroom or it's sort of a discussion or a dialogue TA discussion-led group outside of the content. And then there's the co-curricular. We tend to like to be more proactive and give students skills before responding to different types of events that might happen. But there's always those times that we come in after there have been some challenges. So
yeah. And then the goal, I guess maybe the goals differ partly depending on the particulars of the program. So if you're doing a co-curricular thing versus an extracurricular thing, maybe the goals differ somewhat. But is there like a general goal that the process sort of naturally aims at? Is it conflict resolution, or is it, action, I guess is the fifth step that you mentioned?
we would say their sustained dialogue really has two main goals. So the one goal would be building the relationships of the people in the room. So building understanding, getting a better sense of who's here, why they're here, and how we can build relationships across lines of difference. We don't have to have friends that all believe exactly the same thing that we do. And then the second goal would be some sort of community action, that if the dialogue group has gone through all those 5 stages, we hope that they come up with some form of action that addresses what they've been discussing.
Yeah. And let me ask you, so this is a totally loaded question because I have what I think is the right answer in my brain. And I'll even sort of share what I think. So I guess one question I could envision somebody asking is, okay, I'm thinking about setting up my course. Man, I don't want to devote a whole hour of instructional time every week to something like dialogue. I need more like content, right? I mean, this is a question we would get quite a bit with God in the Good Life. Our dialogues are, in a way, kind of free-floating from the very structured instructional time that students have when they get together in a big auditorium. But I guess I can definitely see sort of student learning related goals and outcomes that sustained dialogue is just very obviously going to promote. And my question is like, for an instructor like this, why do sustained dialogue? Why is it worth it? Why is it good for your course, say, if that was the decision somebody was making, to do sustained dialogue? I was totally, sorry, all over the place, but
no problem. I would say one of the values is so our model is a peer-led model. So typically you have students facilitating students, which I think is really valuable in terms of taking, in some sense, removing that hierarchy and letting students wrestle with whatever topic the course is taking. I think there's a potential for students to be maybe even more open with each other, willing to be perhaps a little bit more vulnerable with each other than they might be in front of a PhD. And if they're wrestling with the content in that way, I think, and connecting it to their personal experiences and their lives, they might take greater ownership over the content. We certainly see when we evaluate even the co-curricular work, students are thinking more critically about their experiences and their beliefs. They're thinking more critically, their empathy skills go up, so they're thinking about each other people's experiences. So I think there's a whole host of things.
Totally. I can also see, I mean, you know, one of the things I think people should be thinking a ton about right now in the 2 to 4 weeks they have before their courses start, either in person, online, or kind of a mixture of both, is how can you build those relationships, those human relationships, and those personal connections in your course. And I imagine even if you have to go online, or if you start online, to have like an hour a week where there's a small group of students personally connecting in the context of your class, like that, to me, just like, I don't know, that's amazing. Do you guys actually, do any of the groups meet primarily online, or is that something that any groups have been trying out with the
So in
COVID
the
stuff?
past,
Yeah.
no, but yes, since March, we have had groups that have been meeting virtually. And you know, as we've all experienced, it's a little bit of a different medium, and it takes some getting used to, but it's certainly doable.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go to another question here. I'm going to share my screen. So here's a question. I think a lot of instructors right now feel pressure or feel a desire to ask students about topics that are just in the news and that we all sort of want to talk about at some level, but we're also nervous to talk about because we might disagree with people, or, you know, we might even sort of fear that just bringing up certain topics is actually going to harm students in our class. So for instance, with response to the, you know, all of the different racial sort of justice issues that have been raised in the news, I would love to talk about that in a philosophy 101 course. I also feel like, oh man, I'd be kind of terrified. Like, what if I ended up doing more harm than good? And so I guess I'll put this like a point on the question just to sort of organize the thoughts here. I'll ask you, are there certain topics that you think you shouldn't ask students to dialogue about, or there's things to steer clear of, or, you know, how do you deal with sensitive questions or sensitive dialogue topics?
Yeah, so this is a really, really good and important question. I think my general answer is I think people are right to be concerned. This is a valid concern. There's most topics I think are totally ripe for dialogue. I think it matters how you set up the container for dialogue. I think
Good. And even, sorry, not to interrupt, but tell me what you mean by that. So if anybody's not familiar, what is a container of dialogue?
yeah, so a lot of people, and I think dialogue is a distinct form of communicating. So it's very different than discussion or debate, and it looks and feels different. And I think we don't necessarily have a lot of models about what that looks and feels like. So making sure that you set up the space, you define what you mean by dialogue and what expectations you have for students to engage in this new way. One important component of that is setting group norms. We always talk about that as being a really essential piece in your first time together. How do we want to communicate with each other? What is this going to look like? How are we going to interact? We often advise, so this looks a little different in a class-based setting, but in terms of these sensitive topic dialogues, we usually offer some form of an out, that if students don't want to have these conversations, they don't have to.
Yeah.
That being said, I think students do want to talk about many of these conversations. They may not know how to. And I think by having a skilled facilitator who's trained in how to set up these, what we call preventions. So how do you define what dialogue is, set up norms to prevent some of the things that could go wrong. We always talk about making sure that you have a norm around dehumanization. So that's just not an acceptable thing to have in the dialogue space. And then having some training around intervention skills. So if somebody says something, how do you intervene effectively in that moment so that it doesn't escalate into a disaster?
Yeah.
So those sorts of things I would say are the first things I think about. And then there are definitely certain types of topics that, you know, we don't want to be prying into the depths of each other's souls in a way that is, you know, that's maybe a therapy conversation. That's not something that is appropriate for dialogue, but definitely social justice, these race conversations are certainly ripe for this type of work.
So one thing, I mean, just to lend kind of support to what you're saying in my own experience, because I trusted you guys when you came and trained our leaders, and I thought like I trust the process, but I was very nervous about this question in particular. And one thing I noticed is that in setting the norms at the beginning, and we talk about norms in this Facebook group, and you know, everywhere I go, I talk about norms a lot. But in setting those norms in the beginning and allowing the students to really define the way that they were going to interact with each other, and for that process to be led by one of their peers rather than somebody coming in and like, you know, who knows like what standards they have in their head, the students started trusting each other and just raising these questions naturally in like a really helpful way. And in a way, honestly, like I didn't directly observe a ton. Like I would just have dialogue leaders come to me and say, whoa, like this discussion we had was crazy, and like here's how it went. But the level of trust that like was required to get students to that point, and the fact that you can get them to that level of trust with each other in say like 3 or 4 weeks is really crazy. I mean, a lot of these students just don't know each other at all. They're total strangers walking into the room, and in 4 weeks, they are comfortable saying like, I really want to talk about this thing that I read about in the news and that I think this course has some sort of bearing on. So that's, I mean, that's just like, I don't know, I guess this is a testimonial. This will be recorded so you can like cut this and, you know, use it. But I like that element, I'm just always impressed by just how important that trust is, and honestly, like how norms can get you there. And maybe here's a way of giving it back to you and asking you to kind of share a bit more about this. You know, what is it about norm setting in particular that establishes that kind of trust? Like what's going on there? What's the magic?
Well, I think there's something that emerges organically about how we're building a space together that is really important. I think, you know, everyone's sort of feeling each other out at the beginning of sitting in a circle or in a Zoom square or whatever it ends up looking like. But I think there's something about posing how we're going to interact in that conversation that's really important. And I think one thing that's also important about norms is they're organic, so they're not set in stone. If things need to change or things need to be modified, it's a helpful tool to refer back to when you're in dialogue, and say, you know, so this one isn't being adhered to, or, you know, I think we need to add something because something has come up. So there's that piece, and I think trusting the process, that students are gonna start small. It's sort of you slowly build that trust, but you know, if you frame it as a question of how do we want to interact and how do we create a learning space for each other where we can feel comfortable asking each other questions, it really goes a long way.
That's awesome. So yeah, one, just to make it sort of even more concrete. So say I'm a viewer, say I've never even thought about like setting norms or what that means. Maybe like a quick example of a norm would help. You mentioned a dehumanization one. Is that like what's the sort of norm that you would say, put this on your list?
We have a few different norms that we recommend. You know, obviously there's always we want it to come from the group that's setting them, but we usually have something in terms of, and we've got a sheet where we recommend things like there needs to be some form of confidentiality norms. So are people going to ideally take the learning out of the circle, but the names and things need to stay? We usually talk about speaking from your own experience, using I statements like that as opposed to use or generalizations. Dehumanization we talk about in terms of, you know, this is a critical component to making sure that everyone in the space feels valued and heard. So language that is dehumanizing is just not going to be part of the conversation. So yeah, we have a few where we tend to recommend, but it really is an opportunity for people to create their own space.
Yeah. I always find students, well, and I honestly, I haven't led a dialogue for a couple of years now. I haven't like taught a small enough course where I could be leading it. We're usually training the dialogue leaders and then, interacting with them somewhat indirectly. A few years ago, this feels like a different world that we were living in. The big sort of worry was partisanship and just political sort of partisanship. And I would walk into a college classroom and I would just kind of feel like when I told the students, we're going to dialogue about all kinds of stuff, things in the news, whatever. I would just feel sort of two different sets of concerns. Like, okay, is this like kind of a progressive brainwashing machine? On the other hand, is this like kind of a secret conservative? So I would feel like there were these two poles, and I constantly had to navigate between the two things. But one thing the norms did was it gave us like this shared set of values that allowed us to kind of step outside that zone. And for us, it was always like the first 2 or 3 weeks there'd be some test, like okay, we're dialoguing, but are we really dialoguing? And somebody'd bring up some topic and they'd say, well, and they'd just say like a really partisan, really short kind of, not too controversial, but controversial view. And what was amazing to me was that the norms would allow students kind of on the other side of the partisan issue to react to that in a very surprising way and just change the tone of the conversation so that suddenly it really did feel like, like an inclusive sort of dialogue where no matter the ideological perspective or background, like, yeah, we're dialoguing. This is about us in this room, not about political signals we're sending to everybody else or anything else like that. So I don't know. To me, that's just a really powerful feature of the process. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
Sorry, I'm a terrible interviewer.
No. This is great, and it's wonderful to hear that the sort of what we teach is really being experienced in the way that we hope it is. No, it's fantastic, and I think norms are very powerful. And we talk about dialogue. The way we talk is about shared experiences and personal experiences and lived experiences. Opinions are not sort of how we talk in dialogue. So even though that's something that is so common in how we communicate with one another, it's a different form of communication. And we always talk about expect everybody in the room around a conversation and create a space where those experiences and perspectives can be heard.
That's so cool. I mean, just like to know that's a conversational move that you can have in dialogue or anywhere. Somebody says something and it's kind of inflammatory, and you say like what sort of is your experience? Like what sort of led to this moment to like you're thinking this way? And you can always go into their story, and it's always like interesting and surprising. And I don't know, I'm just always amazed by that. I was mentioning even before we started talking on the stream, I'll do this at Thanksgiving, with my family. Somebody will say something to start a fight. And I'll just say, that is really, that's interesting. Like what was your first experience with, X, Y, or Z? And suddenly just like everything changes. I don't know. It's cool. Highly recommend.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in terms of, someone says something that can feel inflammatory, and, the natural response is for you to go from your prefrontal cortex, which is like the rational part of your brain where you can think about asking a question or think about it, into what we call the amygdala brain, where it's like, I'm flight, freeze, or fight response. And if you can just ask a question like you just modeled, can really give the opportunity to put everybody back here and really think about it in a much more meaningful way that isn't so conflict ridden.
Oh, that's awesome. So I'm going to ask another question here.
Okay.
I think this is at the front of everybody's mind. And even before I ask this, I'll just say, if anybody on the Facebook feed wants to post a question just directly in the comments, feel free to do that. Kat, our amazing PWOL team member, is going to be curating those and sending them to me. So please feel free to ask your own questions. We'll get to as many as we can. But so let me ask you this question, Elizabeth. I know everybody, especially people who are thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to teach online in just a couple of weeks, is just really worried about engagement and participation. We've all had the experience of either being in an online course or teaching one where there's a required discussion question, like prompt, and everybody has to post something and people just do just the bare minimum. They're kind of terrified. They're like, here's the one sentence that I have to do, and nobody talks to each other. It's just a list of things that people do. So my question is, do you have any insight as somebody who's been working for years with college students and trying to create really deep, meaningful engagement and dialogues? Do you have any insight into like, how do we hack that? Like, what is the thing that we can do? How do we get our students to really engage and really enjoy it instead of just checking a box so that we can give them a participation point? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's an element of again trusting the process and knowing that it takes a little bit of time to build that trust and those relationships for people to be willing to share some personal experiences. So again, the group norms, as we talked about, is really important. And then starting with some icebreakers, start with some things that are less deep. Give them an opportunity to build those relationships and share stories that are perhaps up here rather than going all the way down at the beginning. And I think one of the other things that's great about the peer-led model is it creates an opportunity for that interaction, and perhaps students are more willing to share things with other students. And connecting that to their personal lives and how they feel about certain things. So how questions are framed is really important. But knowing as well as a facilitator that it's not always about you, like give an opportunity for students to pause and think. Silence is okay. If they might need a moment before you lob a question and they might not be ready to answer yet. So give them an opportunity to reflect, maybe write something down. You could play around with some breakout groups to get people to have a sense of building. Maybe people want to talk in pairs before you bring a group together. But I think using some of those types of tools to slowly build the trust and the relationships. You're not going to get a really hearty, awesome conversation in your first dialogue, but it will grow and it will come.
Yeah. This is really cool. So, and it really makes me think differently in a different way about something that comes up at each of the dialogue training sessions that we have with our students. I always tell them dialogue, like here's how I define it. I'm like, dialogue is the kind of conversation you have with somebody and it's already 1 a.m. and you have a hugely busy day tomorrow and you just don't stop. You can't stop talking. You want to know more. And one thing that's really cool is that, okay, what are the conditions for that? Well, you got to trust the person. You have to trust that they care about you and that like you're thinking about this. And another hallmark of that is like those conversations, at least for me, the silences are like immense. Like they're so long. Like you sit there and you just think and then you respond. And it's just so to be able to put yourself in that position and not put pressure on yourself to be like, okay, I'm in a classroom, must perform. I mean, this is like my tendency all the time. But, I think that's really cool. That's really like helping me like kind of think about dialogue even in a new light. I'm going to ask a viewer question.
Yeah.
So Scott is wondering just about the structure of the dialogue groups and the norm setting. So maybe one question that would be helpful to talk about is like how big is a typical dialogue group? And then another thing is, so if you have multiple dialogue groups within a course, say you've got like 50 students and you organize them into different dialogue groups, his question is, does each dialogue group make its own norms, or do you make the norms as a class and then kind of hand out a sheet to each of those groups and have them go forth? Or how does that work? So that's his question.
Yeah, so the sustained dialogue model would recommend dialogue groups in the range of 8 to 12 is typically a good space, large enough that you're going to have different voices, but small enough that people can share and everybody has an opportunity to speak. If you're speaking around for an hour, if you have 30 people, you might not get everybody, but if you have 12, it's probably likely. So the size that's our recommended approach in terms of sizing. In terms of group norms and so if you have 50 students, say you have 5 different dialogue groups, our advice would probably be to let each dialogue group set their own. I think we sometimes do have guidelines for make sure 2 or 3 of these norms are consistent, and then you can build from those. But trust each group to shape them.
Yeah. And I guess just even to emphasize here too, the model is that, so one of those students in that group will be a peer leader. They'll have been trained and they'll know how to set norms. They might have the depersonalization norm in the background and something about respect in the back. They'll kind of know those things, but they get to lead the individual group. And in our case, I guess probably most cases, you know, I'm not in the room when they do that. Sometimes don't even know what the norms are, which I think, again, adds to this sort of level of trust that the students can have and develop with each other.
Exactly.
That's great. Thanks to Scott for that excellent question. If anybody else has questions, they can post them. I'll ask a couple of more things. I know you have to go at 3:55, Elizabeth, so we won't go past that marker. Let me go back for a second. Okay, so we're thinking about teaching online courses. One way you might have a dialogue would be to have students meeting on Zoom. Do any of the things that you guys have learned in facilitating these conversations translate over to written discussions or discussion boards or chat functionality? Or is it really, really key that, like, at least, you know, mediated by a screen, there's got to be like face-to-face sort of verbal contact? How does that work?
So I think our thinking is there's so much to listening to each other that is nonverbal in terms of looking at the body's interactions, the tone of voice, how people are saying what they're saying, that I think in general, if you can do it on a synchronous Zoom or something like that, that would be better.
Yeah.
Now, there are certainly ways to put it in writing, but it is definitely harder.
Yeah.
A short answer.
Yeah, no, totally. Like, how do you actively listen? I mean, like, I could actively listen at my keyboard, but like, yeah, you gotta. Do you find, even though, so even in your online experience now, you know, leading these sessions, I don't know if you've done the trainings for any entirely online groups. Do you find that, you know, there are ways of replicating those cues or helping people, you know, get the conversational back and forth that you get in person? I guess we're doing that now, but, you know, how well does it translate in your experience?
Yeah, I think pretty well, actually. I think I've been really pleasantly surprised in terms of being able to read people pretty well. There is certainly a challenge in terms of it's a little bit harder to figure out who's going to speak when and those sorts of things. But in general, the groups tend to develop a way to communicate, and it does work.
Yeah. If you're doing it as part of a class, you're going to have the dialogue leaders, their peer-led dialogues, etc. How do you tie in grading, participation, assessment, or how do you recommend that instructors do this? I mean, one worry I could see is like, man, if I'm not even observing, you know, how am I going to assign grades to these students? And if I don't assign grades, or if I just give them, like, you know, completion points or whatever, like, what reason do they even have to go and participate? Any thoughts on that? I mean, any thoughts on that?
I can offer some. I defer some of that to you all who teach, but I do think that a couple of thoughts. One that we often recommend, and I know some use, is a sort of personal reflection paper or journal of some form of how the time in the dialogue was impactful for them personally, how it connected to the coursework. So something like that is a possibility. That's usually our advice. I'm sure there are a ton of varieties of ways to do it, but yeah.
I like that. So some sort of product that the dialogue's feeding into, but that is more objective. It's sort of on a page, and I can, like, look at it. I think that's great. I've also, I mean, I guess this is kind of a loaded question too. I've also just, like, found that students are really, by week 3, very internally motivated to be part of the dialogue. I mean, just the social community, like the natural sort of rewards of having a really meaningful conversation with people. To me, like, at the end of the semester, I could fail them all for, like, that section. They wouldn't care. They'd keep going. They'd be like, I just want to be there. So that's something that really surprises me. But I don't know. I guess, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we hear a lot that feedback about, you know, this is, it's really in some ways a transformative experience for them of having this space for interaction and able to communicate and build meaningful relationships with people who they might never have otherwise encountered. And it can be a really rewarding experience for students.
Yeah.
That they don't find other ways. There aren't that many type opportunities like this.
Yeah. Lightning round. Couple final questions. One, is a group of like 5 or 6 students too small to have a dialogue? Is there like a lower sort of bound? Like, should they be at least 8? You said 8 to 12, I think, is ideal for a group size.
8 to 12 is ideal. We certainly have dialogues that have a small number like that. But the downside to that is there is a risk of not having as many different voices and different perspectives. So you might miss certain things. So it might be harder for a facilitator to sort of share perspectives that aren't in the room. It just might be more work for them.
That makes sense. Yeah. So 8 to 12. It's like ideal. Yeah.
Ideally, but you can make anything work. Larger is harder, I think, in terms of you're just going to miss some voices, but
yeah.
You can make it work.
Yeah. And typically, how are these peer dialogue fellows for the trainings that you do? Like, how is that even structured? So I know at Notre Dame, we hire students from previous versions of the class to be the peer dialogue leaders. Does that tend to be the model? Like, do the peer dialogue leaders across like the curricular, extracurricular, et cetera models, they tend to be like hired student workers? Or is there a variety of sort of ways of organizing that?
There's a whole range from what you've articulated in terms of them getting some sort of stipend to completely volunteer. But typically those who are facilitating have participated in the dialogues before.
Yeah. So they have like the experience to draw on, and then of course training.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess if anybody wants to get in touch with the Sustained Dialogue Institute and, wants to have you guys come out and do a training, is the best way to do that just to visit your website?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a form on the website that you can fill out to say, I'm interested in a training or I'm interested in learning more. And we get those and we'd be happy to talk to you.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much again. I really appreciate that you took the time to have this conversation. And it was great to just, after 4 years, kind of think back on where our Dialogue Fellows program just even started. And just all the ways in which the things that we're talking about today, norm setting and organizing these groups, establishing those kind of meaningful, trusting communities, has just really contributed to the culture of our class. I mean, it's just been fun for me to reflect on that. And we have so much to be grateful for. So thank you, and thank everybody at the Sustained Dialogue Institute. And we really appreciate it. I know you got to go by 4. And so I think with that, if you want to have any last words, you can have a last word.
Oh my goodness, that's a lot of pressure. No, I'll just say thank you so much for what you're doing, and thank you to all of those who are watching, who are wrestling with these things and thinking about how to put them in their courses. I think it's this type of work is hard but super meaningful, and your students will really appreciate it. So thank you all.
That's awesome. So for anybody watching on the Facebook group, we're going to be back next week with Caleb Coho and Stephen Grimm. The details were emailed to the listserv, but if anybody needs that info, just post in the comments here or when we post this on the YouTube channel, and we'll get you the info for that session and the paper if you want to read it ahead, but there's no pressure to read it ahead. Thank you once again. And with that, I think we'll sign off, and yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah,
Bye.
you too.